In the Anthropocene, ecosystems are changing rapidly. Habitat alteration, species invasions, and other environmental changes are reshaping ecological communities and forcing species to adapt to new conditions. But while some species can survive these rapid changes, others cannot and go extinct. But why? In this interview, we talk to Dr. Tom Matthews about how we can predict species extinction and why some species are better able to cope with environmental change than others. Tom is a senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham, where he studies the impact of global environmental change on biodiversity.
So Tom, tell us, why do some species survive while others go extinct?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the first thing to say is we're talking here about sort of anthropogenic extinction. So this is where species where we as humans have been involved in it. Obviously, extinction is a natural process that's happening long before humans came along. But in the context then of anthropogenic extinctions, I think that the main kind of characteristics of species that we've driven extinct are that the majority of them were endemic to islands. So I think in general across taxa, 75% of known recorded human extinctions have been of island endemics. And if we look specifically at birds, which is the group that I kind of research the most, we know of about roughly 600 birds that we've driven extinct in the last kind of 100,000 year time period, which roughly corresponds to when modern humans evolved and kind of migrated out of Africa around the world. About 80% of them were endemic to islands. And by this, I mean that they evolved and they only ever existed on islands, and mostly just on a single island. And this is kind of linked then to their range size. So range size is a good sort of characteristic if we're trying to understand what species go extinct. And obviously, if you're endemic to an island, in general, you're going to have quite a small range. But then we can ask, is that the only reason? Is it only because island endemics have a small range? And no, in reality, there's a lot more going on. A lot of islands around the world have been subject to a lot of kind of human-induced threats. So habitat loss, invasive species, hunting, all the drivers that we also see on the mainlands, but they've often had larger effects on islands, both in terms of the amount of impacts there have been, and also because then they're happening in a small sort of delineated area. So, and then we often talk about this, we can describe it as the cocktail of threats. So we have all these different threats happening at the same time and often interacting. And a good example of this then is we can also actually have natural events which are extinction drivers. So something like a hurricane, but actually the impact of that hurricane is so much worse because we've had these other drivers. So a good example is the Bahama nuthatch, which is a bird that's probably now extinct. As the name sort of describes, it was endemic to islands in the Caribbean. And they think it went extinct 2 hurricanes that have hit in the last 10 years. But we shouldn't really put this down to a natural extinction because the population was much smaller because of habitat loss. So it basically only survived in one small area of forest because we chopped the rest down. So that when the hurricanes came, it had a much more devastating impact. So it's another kind of issue with islands. Then on top of that, we also have the fact that many island species have evolved in a certain way to adapt to the island conditions, something that we often call kind of under this umbrella term of island syndromes. So I won't go into detail about what all these different kinds of syndrome, but it's just ways that island species have evolved to adapt to the island conditions. And often this is kind of reduced predation, reduced competition. A very famous example in birds is flightlessness. So birds that reach islands often lose the ability to fly. And this is because flying is kind of energetically costly. And if there's no predators on an island, you don't actually need to fly. You can use this energy in other ways. So over time then, birds kind of lose the ability to fly, which puts them at a great risk of introduced species or hunting. But it's important to point out that this evolutionary strategy was very sensible pre-humans. Before humans were around, it didn't make sense to use the energy to fly. It's just then that when humans come, the strategy is no longer very sensible, but the impacts are happening at such a quick rate that there isn't really enough time to kind of evolve a different sort of syndrome. So yeah, so the species on the islands, they've got small ranges, there's a lot of threats, they may have evolved in a certain way that puts them at greater risk. Also, so flightlessness, another kind of big one is like naivety. So this is kind of a famous thing that's associated with the dodo, for example. If you don't have predators, you kind of lose that avoidance, that behavioral avoidance to predators, which again, then when humans come and when they introduce cats, rats, etc., you don't have the defense mechanisms to sort of avoid that, and you're more likely to kind of go extinct. It's not just island species that have gone extinct, and traits, so characteristics of the organisms, are also important determinants of extinction in mainland environments. So just again, if you have a small range, body size, so larger bodied species in a lot of different taxonomic groups tend to be more at risk. Just larger species tend to have larger home ranges, they need more energy, they occur in smaller numbers, so they tend to be at risk. There is some luck of the draw, right? You could be a species very specialized, very small range, but you just happen to exist in a part of the world where humans haven't had much impact. You could be a species which is endemic to a lowland area, and therefore with climate change you can shift your distribution up, or you could be a species with exactly the same size range, but you're endemic to the top of the mountain, and then you've nowhere to go with climate change. So there's a sort of a luck element in it, I suppose, from the point of view of the species. But I think, just in general, what we've seen so far is it's mostly been island endemics that we've lost.
So we know a lot about why species which went extinct actually went extinct, so the reason behind it. Can you tell a little bit more about if we're also able to predict now, based on this knowledge, which species might be the next who will go?
Yeah, and I mean, in a short answer to can we predict, I think yes, but not perfectly would be the short answer. And I think my previous answer kind of explains why we can do it quite well. We know in general what are the traits associated with extinction. So as I mentioned, body mass, flightlessness in birds. If you had no information, if you knew the species was endemic to islands, you could already build a relatively good predictive model. So yeah, we kind of know the traits that are associated with extinction risk, population size, and these kind of things. So we can predict relatively well. Obviously, for certain taxonomic groups, we lack a lot of this data. So it becomes harder. But for vertebrates, for example, for many kind of plant groups, we can predict this reasonably well. What becomes more difficult is sometimes predicting the drivers. So for example, we know that a given species might be at risk from a certain kind of introduced predator, but it's very hard to predict when is this predator going to be introduced. And a really kind of good example of this is avian malaria in Hawaii. So this was introduced 150 years ago to Hawaii. Humans introduced this disease, and the native passerine birds on the island, they had no resistance, and it's driven a lot of them extinct. And many of them were kind of already suffering for other reasons, and the malaria was like the final nail in the coffin. But for some, it was the big driver of extinction. And this is, again, you have this interaction of threats. So there's a big interaction between the malaria and climate change, because the mosquitoes were originally could only survive at the lower elevations of the island. And so the birds would sort of move up to try and escape. But then as the climate has warmed, the mosquitoes have moved up and up. And now the birds kind of only exist on the top of these Hawaiian islands. But before that was introduced, that's very hard to predict, right? It's very hard to predict that we as humans are going to introduce avian malaria to Hawaii, because these are accidental. No one purposely introduced this. So yeah, in some respects we can predict things quite well, but there's always these elements that are much harder to predict. I think it's basically the actions of humans that become harder to predict. It's easier to predict, say, the long-term effects of climate change than it is to predict when we're going to introduce a particular species where.
So extinction in general is a very grim topic. Can you maybe tell us a success story about a species which we were able to bring back from the brink of extinction?
Yeah. I mean, working in extinction is often like, can get you down, but within all the negative stories, there are some good news stories. I think it's also important to point out that actually, even like long ago when many of these things went extinct, there was some recognition that, to try and save stuff. It wasn't always just like things went extinct and no one cared. It's just I'm reading lots of accounts of these old kind of extinctions, like we're talking about the birds that went extinct in Hawaii like 100 years ago. And often people did realize, but it often was just too late. So when the species started getting very low, they would often then try and move some of the individuals to another island or something, but it was always, the technology wasn't there, the timing was too late. So it's actually quite like heartbreaking in a way to read some of these things. Like people were really trying, but it was just, it's too late. But a good example of a case where this didn't happen, where it wasn't too late, is there's the Guam rail. So the Guam rail is a bird that was endemic to the island of Guam in the Pacific. And it's a rail, it's flightless, so it ticks many of the boxes that we were talking about earlier. And so on the island of Guam I think it was in the early 1950s, the brown tree snake was introduced from South Pacific to the island of Guam. Again, going back to what we were saying before, the species that evolved there, they had no kind of defenses against this predator, and the snake had no predators itself, so it just ran riot, ate everything on the island. I think the Guam rail in the 60s estimated to have about 80,000 individuals. By the 80s, it had gone extinct in the wild. So the snake had a huge impact very quickly, and it wasn't just the rail; it basically decimated the island. Many things went extinct, and again, so hard to predict that when that species was going to be introduced, but easy to predict what the impacts of that introduction will be, or easier. So it basically went extinct in the wild. I think it actually went extinct in the wild in the year I was born, 1987. But luckily, some people there had taken some for a captive breeding population. And in the last sort of like 10, 15 years, they managed to reintroduce it to islands off the coast of Guam. So it couldn't be reintroduced to the main island because the snake's still there. But they managed to eradicate rats on kind of offshore islands. It's reintroduced. And a few years ago now, it got downgraded from extinct in the wild to critically endangered. So it's one of only 2 birds that's ever followed that trajectory. The other was the Californian condor. So going from extinct in the wild to critically endangered. It's a good news story. It's not like the end of the road though, because in general, being critically endangered isn't a good kind of thing, but it's better than being extinct in the wild. But it's always that, they exist on these 2 little offshore islands off Guam, and you run the risk, the snakes manage to get there somehow, people, accidentally introduce rats, and again, you're back to kind of square one. So it's a good news story, but it's still, slightly risky situation.
So Tom, if you could bring back a species from extinction, do you have a favorite one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. There's a few that kind of spring to mind. I think the obvious one is from someone who's focuses a lot on extinct birds is the dodo. It's like kind of the icon of extinction. But there are other things. There's the elephant birds of Madagascar. So these were the biggest birds who have ever existed. Again, driven extinct by humans most likely. Just to see them, see the biggest bird ever would be amazing. There's things that aren't birds as well. I was always fascinated by the Tasmanian tiger. I think it's really cool to see. A slightly less interesting one, but for someone from the UK, is slender-billed curlew. So this was a species that was still around when I was being alive. It's very mysterious. So it was where it bred was not fully understood. Why it went extinct was not fully understood. And there was so I do a lot of bird watching in the UK. And there was I think 2 famous birds that turned up in like 1998 and 2004. And the 2004 bird would actually be the last time this bird was ever potentially seen. And it caused huge debate. It got added to the British list of birds, and then about 10 years ago it got removed. And now the thinking is that it never was this. It was a misidentification. But it's always like kind of captivated me, this species. So it would be quite interesting to bring that back. I think another example which would be really cool to see was the passenger pigeon of America. But in that case, you would need to bring back not just the species, but the whole population, because there are these stories of how at one time it was the most abundant bird in the world, or believed to be one of the most abundant birds of the world. There are billions of individuals. Their nesting aggregations were thought to be like 100 kilometers long. So when you read these old accounts of when they flew over, it like completely blackened the sky, and it was like, just to see something like this would be amazing. It probably wouldn't be able to exist in the modern world. But no, I think, so there's loads of different ones it would be cool to bring back. But I think if I had to pick one, I think it would be the dodo. It's just the kind of the classic icon of extinction, right? And just to actually see one, like, I think would be amazing. So yeah, I think I would bring this back.
Yeah, I fully agree. Thanks a lot, Tom.
No, thank you.